Hi, and welcome to the Restorative Wellness Clinicians Corner, a video series exclusively for functional health professionals, where we interview the top experts in the latest research, products, tools, and best practices for getting your clients exceptional results. Super excited to have our medical director, Dr. Chris Turnpaugh, here with us again. This is going to be a fantastic talk, picking up from where we left off last time. And for those of you who did not hear his first presentation, which was back in, I think, at the beginning of January, we will make sure to post the link to that replay anywhere you're watching this video. So it will either be in the YouTube description, or if you're looking at it on the blog, it will be in the blog. We'll also pop it in the emails. But we're going to take a deep dive into the, we talked last time about some alternate cardiovascular markers that are not necessarily looked at in conventional medicine. And are much more effective and accurate in helping us to get a true status and idea of our clients' cardiovascular health. And he's going to take us looking at those same markers, but on the journey through neurological health. It's going to be wonderful. Let me just read his bio for those of you for whom this is your first introduction. So Dr. Chris Turnpaugh is a practitioner and CEO at Turnpaugh Health, which is a functional medicine wellness center, which he founded in 1999. This center, which is one of the largest in the country, has grown to over 20 healthcare providers and a team of more than 50 in 5 locations. Turnpaugh Health provides in-depth holistic care focusing on functional medicine, investigating the mechanisms of dysfunction in their patients. The clinic also provides integrative family medicine, lifestyle medicine, and many complementary wellness services. Over his 20 years in practice, Dr. Turnpaugh has joined ILADS and is known as a thought leader in Lyme disease and associated co-infections. He also traveled to Lake Como to participate on the PANDAS International Board. He has a deep interest and extensive knowledge in pediatric neurological disorders and methods of supporting these children holistically. Dr. Turnpaugh has lectured on a broad variety of health topics, both nationally and internationally. His application of functional medicine as it relates to the neuroendocrine immune systems is a unique clinical approach to non-pharmacological treatments. He is well respected amongst his peers and patients as a provider and functional medicine instructor. He's treated thousands of patients in his practice, mentored hundreds of practitioners, including yours truly. His true passion is teaching functional medicine to other practitioners and helping patients to optimize their health. So we are so delighted to have you with us today, Dr. Turnpaugh. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
I'm going to turn it over to you from here. We're going to set aside a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, and you will all have access to this replay. So buckle up. This is going to be great.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to do a brief overview of what we did last time real quickly, and then I will go into how it relates to cholesterol transport, which is not commonly thought of, but cholesterol transport in the brain and what effects it can have in the brain. So as I shared earlier, had a pretty stressful weekend, so I put this together like this afternoon. So if there's typos, forgive me, but we'll go through it. There'll be plenty of time for question and answer at the end. So I'm going to try and do my drawing here. So see if I can. All right. All right. So you can see my screen, correct? Okay, good. So this is what I tried to draw last time. We had a little technical difficulties on my end, so I couldn't draw it out. So you're going to get snapshots. I'm just going to walk through cholesterol and with the lab markers we spoke of last time. So I'm going to just go through the mechanisms. First, you eat food, which has fat and triglycerides in it. Once you do that, your gallbladder releases bile salts, which kind of wrap around it. And then it makes a layer that's water loving and fat loving. So we get 2 sides to it so we can get into the bloodstream. wraps around it in these little balls. Then your pancreas releases lipase, which breaks it down, and you get into free fatty acids, you get your cholesterol, and then your fat-soluble vitamins, your vitamin A, D, E, and K. Crosses through, this is my healthy gut wall here, as you can tell. So I have a healthy gut wall here. It goes from here into the lymph and forms what's called the chylomicron. From here, it goes into the bloodstream. When it gets into the bloodstream, it has an Apo B48 on it. That's not the Apo B that we talk about when we're running labs of Apo B. That's Apo B100. So I just want to differentiate that. At this point, our friend, the HDL, donates an Apo E and an Apo C2. Now, Apo E, many of us have heard about because the Apo E 2, 3s, and 4s, with Apo E4 having a higher predisposition to Alzheimer's. Get one from mom, one from dad, so you can be an Apo E4, 4, or any combination of 2, 3, and 4. You can be a 2, 3, a 3, 3, a 2, 4, any combination of the like. Now here, after we donate it, these are important because Apo E binds to your LDL receptors and Apo C2 activates the capillary beds so that you can donate your cholesterol and triglycerides to the tissue. You can donate to into your fat in the form of free fatty acids. You can donate into your muscle as a form of energy. Oh, when I skip a step here. Then at this point, it'll donate the Apo C2 back to the HDL. The leftover molecule goes back to the liver, and through the receptors, it gets sucked up into the liver. Here, this cholesterol is either stored, it becomes bile salts, it forms all the membranes of your cell. We'll talk briefly about what's called membrane fluidity. So your cells have that bilipid layer, double fat layer around it. It's made from this, and it makes the cell more like an amoeba, so it can talk to other cells easily, or it gets repackaged. When it gets repackaged, this is your VLDL. This is when we stick the Apo B100 on it. Now, this is the lab marker that you'll see when you run Apo B100. It is this actual marker. And from this point on, it maintains that B100 all the way through the VLDL, the IDL, and the LDL cholesterol. So when I tell the story, the cholesterol is a bunch of balls, it's fat, it has to go into a boat. The boat it can get on basically is an HDL boat or an LDL boat. And so they're not good or bad cholesterol. They're just balls in a boat. The reason they're called good or bad cholesterol, which people say, is because anything with a B100 on it can deposit cholesterol in the artery wall. It has to have a B100 on it to deposit it into the cholesterol, into the artery wall. And the HDL, which has a captain of that boat, which is an Apo A-1, comes along and does reverse cholesterol. So it sucks it out of it's like the vacuum cleaner that sucks it up. So here we get our first introduction to B100. When this comes back into the system, our HDL then donates the Apo E and the Apo C2 back. So then we go through the progression. This VLDL with the B100 on it will then start to donate its triglycerides. It turns into the VLDL. When it turns into a VLDL, it donates its Apo C2 back to HDL, but it maintains its B100. And then we get what's called the VLDL remnant. Still maintains the B100, but now it gets a lot of Apo E's on it. This is all the VLDL remnant, which is a real short half-life, is also called your IDL, your intermediate density lipoprotein. Here we'll donate more of the cholesterol back to the adrenal cortex as well as to the liver. It's used in the adrenal cortex to make your hormones like aldosterone, cortisol, and DHEA. And then it goes back into the liver as the IDL. When the IDL comes back out into the bloodstream, It donates the Apo E, but maintains the B100, and now it goes to what we commonly call the LDL. But it's important that all the way through this, it's had the B100 on it. And whenever a ship floats around in your bloodstream with a B100 on it, it can deposit cholesterol into the artery wall. Even at this, how that happened? When the B100 or when the LDL is now formed, it will still donate to the gonads, the adrenal gland, and 70% of it goes back to the liver. So it's still useful. So here we see it will donate to the LDL with the B100 will donate to the gonads, the adrenal gland, or the liver. But when there's leftover, it starts to deposit into the endothelium. When those cholesterol particles are matched up with reactive oxygen species or oxidized stress, the LDL becomes oxidized. This is your marker, oxidized LDL. This is in the endothelial wall. This is inflammatory. So whenever we have inflammation, we recruit our macrophages, our big eaters, and they eat this up. When the macrophage eats the oxidized LDL, that's when it forms what's called the foam cell. So we see the foam cell here with a bunch of oxidized LDL that goes into the tunica intima, and this is the beginning of atherosclerosis, or ASCVD. Our HDL with the apolipoprotein A1 comes along and will suck some of that cholesterol back out. It turns into the HDL3 subparticle, HDL2 subparticle, and all the way along, this will donate more useful free fatty acids to the gonads and to the adrenal gland. The rest of it, the HDL2, goes back and deposits the cholesterol back into the liver where it can be repurposed. So this is where we ended kind of last time. And then we looked at some markers in addition to that, but this was the importance of, rather than just looking at cholesterol or HDL or LDL, we want to really see what the risk factors are, and that's Apo B and Apo A1. Apo B is a marker you can get now. It's less expensive than a total cholesterol panel. And it is an independent marker because it is the only thing that can deposit cholesterol into the artery wall. So that's kind of the background. Last time I had technical difficulties and had to draw that freehand. So not that this is a good picture, but this one was a little bit different than the last one. So I'm going to stop sharing and resharing to go to my slideshow now. So I put a picture in here you'll have as a reference. This is the diagram in formal fashion of everything that I just went through. So you'll have a reference. You'll see how you eat food. It goes into your intestines. You get things stuck to it. There's your B48. This is your chylomicron, which is in your lymphatic system, goes into the capillaries. You get the Apo E on it with the B48. And then it comes back, goes into the liver and comes back out. So you have a nice picture of everything in one drawing. Somehow I skipped. This is an actual picture of an Apo B LDL particle. And you'll notice on this is the boat that's carrying these little free cholesterols and phospholipids in it. So you get your cholesterol in here. Cholesterol here is the same as it is on an HDL or an Apo A1 carrier. It's just packaged in a different way. This is wrapped in a ribbon called Apo B100. And on these particles, it has, if I call this the boat, this is the rudder of the boat. The rudder of the boat in this section here, these are called crinkles. In this section here is where you can carry your lipoprotein little a. I think we talked about that a little bit last time, your lipoprotein little a. So I call this the rudder of the boat. The amount of little balls you have here are the amount of lipoprotein little a's you can carry. So when people say lipoprotein little a is genetic, it's really just the difference. Here's another picture. They're called crinkles because they say they look like Danish crinkles. I don't know. These are two different molecules that are the same, Notice the tail or the rudder on this person's tail. The red section is relatively short compared to this person's. So you see there's only 12 repeats on this one, and there's 36 on this one. So when you run a lipoprotein little a, you'll see people either have a generally low lipoprotein little a, or they'll have a relatively large lipoprotein little a. And many people will say run it just once, because it tells you genetically if they have a long tail or they don't have a long tail. That's what they're referring to. I run it more frequently because the amount of lipoprotein little a's in the tail varies based on inflammation. So if you're really inflamed, it goes up. And a lot of the concepts that you've talked about and learned about all really start to come together, because if you have chronic inflammation, you're more likely to get cardiovascular disease. We say it's an inflammatory disease. One of the reasons for that is you're going to get more lipoprotein little a's stuck on this tail, and it's more likely then to deposit cholesterol into the artery wall. So while it's said to run once, I run it all the time. I don't know if we should, but that's what I do. It's a tremendous risk marker for for aortic stenosis. So it is the number one risk factor for aortic stenosis. In Europe, it's standard by age 12. In Canada, they run Apo B. In Australia, they run Apo B a lot more than they do in the United States. It's not even accepted in the United States as a standard marker. So this just gives you a picture of what we're referring to. This is where we're headed today. So it's a little bit complicated, but I'll just break it down very simply. And what this is showing is in the blood vessel on the top, you'll see again, the same thing comes from the intestines, chylomicron. So I'll kind of put my cursor over it. So you get your intestines, here your chylomicron, where you pick up the B48, goes into the liver. Then it'll come out as an Apo. It can come out as an Apo A-100, but it can also come out here where you have your Apo B. You get your Apo B here. You'll pick up, that's where your VLDL, your IDL, and your LDL come in, and it goes back to the liver. This is your risky particle. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about how you notice that Apo B, anything with an Apo B, doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. Only the Apo A-1 does. So Apo A-1, Apo B has the job of delivering cholesterol, and when it doesn't have anybody to hand it off to, it puts it in the artery wall. Apo A-1 comes along, sucks up that cholesterol in the artery wall, but it has more jobs to do other than that. It goes into the brain and helps with cholesterol transport in the brain, because the brain is incredibly exhaustive in its use of energy. So it's going to use sugar, or it's going to use ketones, but it needs a constant fuel supply because it burns a disproportionate amount of our energy. So it needs it for tissue repair, membrane fluidity, which we talked about before, and energy for these cells in the brain. We see Apo E does work in the actual blood vessel and periphery, but it also does work here in the brain. And Apo E gets this bad rap because it's the Alzheimer's gene, but Apo E protects us against so many things. And actually, the Apo E4 subtype was, quote unquote, the original subtype. And we've mutated to the 3s and the 2s. 3 is now the dominant strain. 2 is rare. 4 is rare. And 4 is very protective. It reacts extremely vigilantly when there's inflammation around. So for an Apo E4 subtype, super important to maintain health in the patient, because the reason that Apo E4 has an increased proclivity towards Alzheimer's is because Alzheimer's is an inflammatory disease, and those beta amyloid plaques and those tau proteins are defensive mechanisms to protect the brain against inflammation. So I just put a quick slide in here with a descriptive thing We see that Apo E isn't a bad guy, right, or a bad woman. Apo E blocks peroxidation of lipids, blocks platelet aggregation, so it decreases the risk of stroke. It increases nitric oxide for blood flow. So it does an awful lot of things other than just give us the predisposition towards Alzheimer's. And I put a little narrative in there of all the things it does, and I stole that from somewhere. I'm not taking credit for that. So I put the top 8 causes of death here because when we're screening for ASCVD, it's applicable to brain health, it's applicable to inflammation, and in all of ASCVD cofactors are found in most of the top 8 causes of death, with the exception of accidents. So we have heart disease, it's related to cancer, stroke. It doesn't relate to chronic lower respiratory disease, but Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, and liver disease. So if we take the top 8 causes of death, all but 2 of them are related to some form of cholesterol transport inflammatory cascade. So when you look at cholesterol, many people look at it, they say, what's the cardiologist realm? In our world, in functional health and functional medicine, it's really a hallmark of all other physiology going on in the body, including the brain. But many times we're not looking at cholesterol as it relates to the brain. Many of the top neurologists studying neurodegenerative disease actually want your cholesterol higher. They say it's a risk factor when it's below 200. There's many of the top names in neurodegenerative disease want higher cholesterol because cholesterol can be very protective for brain. So the importance of cholesterol in the brain. Cholesterol is a critical component of cell membranes in the brain. It's involved in the formation of synapses, which are crucial to the communication between the cells. It's important for the synthesis of myelin, which is that fatty sheath that insulates the neuron and helps it move real fast. And it's involved in other cellular processes, including making neurotransmitters and the regulation of that membrane fluidity so the brain can talk to itself correctly. So it has a lot of positive benefits in the brain. An explanation of transport to and from the brain. Cholesterol is not very soluble in water, as we said before, so it needs to be transported to and from the brain with these specialized proteins. These are the boats that I was talking about. So it gets into the brain through Apo E, Apo A-1, and ATP binding cassette transporters. There are others, but those are the big 3. There's an Apo C3 as well. Cholesterol transport is important for maintaining healthy function of the brain and preventing accumulation of cholesterol and other lipids in the brain, which can contribute to development of neurodegenerative diseases. So this is really a transport. It's not just a static number. And when you have things like Apo A-1, which can move cholesterol into the brain, but also has the ability to pick it up and take it out of the brain, that becomes extremely beneficial. So we'll go over a couple of these. Apo E is synthesized in the liver, transported to the bloodstream to the brain, where it is taken up by neurons and astrocytes. So most of these are either made in the intestines or the liver, and there's so much focus on intestinal health and liver function health, and it doesn't just play a role in detoxification and leaky gut, but in a healthy environment, you're able to make these healthy lipoproteins. Apo E helps to transport cholesterol to the neurons and astrocytes, where it's used to synthesis of cell membranes and the formation of synapses. And Apo E has different forms, we said, with Apo E4 being the most common genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's. But there are centenarians who are Apo E4, and the reason is they probably either have other genetic factors that are protective or they've lived a healthy lifestyle. And there's a couple tests out now that can demonstrate that you can reduce or possibly eliminate your risk of Alzheimer's with proper cell function in the brain, which is able to be achieved with new advanced testing. So Apo E, Apo A-1, and Apo C3. Apo A-1 is a protein made in the liver and the intestines. It's the major component of HDL cholesterol, but it gives that HDL cholesterol its function. So it's a functional test. HDL will go up when you're inflamed as well, and it doesn't carry the same function. Apo A-1 plays an important role in the reverse cholesterol transport pathway, which is a fancy way to say it sucks the cholesterol out and takes it back to the liver, where it takes the excess cholesterol from the peripheral tissue, including the brain. So it's that vacuum cleaner that picks up the excess cholesterol and takes it back to the brain. ATP binding cassette transporter, if you break the word down, this is a protein that uses ATP energy. So it uses that ATP to transport cholesterol and other lipids across cell membranes. And I'll touch briefly on the mitochondria. And this is why mitochondrial health is so important, so that we can make our ATP to support these ATP binding cassettes so we can actually transport this cholesterol in a healthy fashion. These transporters help to remove excess cholesterol from the brain, which is important for prevention of accumulation of cholesterol and other lipids that can contribute to neurodegenerative diseases. And ApoC3 is a protein that regulates metabolism of triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, which have been linked to cardiovascular disease and insulin resistance. So when we get dysfunction in the cholesterol transport and neurodegenerative diseases, we'll see things like this. We'll try to do an overview of how dysfunction in cholesterol transport can contribute to the degenerative disease process. So this can lead to accumulation of cholesterol and other lipids in the brain, which can contribute to the development of neurodegenerative diseases, all of them, not just Alzheimer's, but Alzheimer's is the hallmark one. Therapeutic targets. So you can use niacin or fibrates and other potential therapeutic drugs that inhibit the amyloid beta production and enhance amyloid beta clearance. Although I will say at this point, the drugs that have been successful in removing or enhancing the clearance have not shown any promise in the reduction of senility or neurodegenerative diseases. So I don't know if it's a smoking gun that we're looking at. That's what I kind of alluded to in the beginning there. When we have these tau proteins and beta amyloid plaques in the brain, that may be a result of, but not the cause of, neurodegenerative diseases. Other potential targets including anti-inflammatories, which is big in our world, and antioxidants, which is also big in our world. So a functional medicine approach to cholesterol transport and health in the brain. This is very redundant to all of you, I'm sure, but an individualized assessment and treatment. It emphasizes the importance of an assessment and treatment taking into account such factors as genetics, lifestyle, and environmental exposures of a lifetime. So we want to assess the cholesterol transport. Now, in order to assess cholesterol transport, we have to start looking at those Apo A1s in a ratio to Apo B. We look at cognitive markers and other metabolic markers. Some nutritional interventions to support the cholesterol transport. Obvious ones, not a lot of sugar. We don't want too much. When we make too much sugar, we're going to turn that into a triglyceride, and then we start down the pathway of too much cholesterol. In addition, supplementation with omega-3 fatty acids have been shown to be neuroprotective. Coenzyme Q10, again, if we support the mitochondria, we're going to support that ATP binding cassette transporter. So we want to make sure that our mitochondria are working relatively healthy. And vitamin D has been associated with cognitive improvement and neurodegenerative diseases. And vitamin D may support cholesterol transport because vitamin D is super important in our gene expression. So it helps us express our genes in an appropriate fashion. Resveratrol will help reduce inflammation, and the anti-inflammatory effects may also improve cholesterol metabolism by activating your AMP kinase pathways, which will then, again, support that ATP binding cassette transporters. So you don't have to know all the deep dive stuff, but I'm sure a lot of you are recommending anti-inflammatories like resveratrol and curcumin, and this may be the mechanism of action. It may not directly lower your cholesterol, but it reduces the inflammatory effects, and it helps with these ATP binding cassette proteins. Quercetin is another favorite of mine. So quercetin is found in things like onions, and quercetin has been shown to have a pretty big anti-inflammatory effect. A lot of people use it for like asthma and allergies. Quercetin is the flavonoid that they made the drug Singulair off of. And quercetin has been shown to reduce brain inflammation and improve cognitive function. And perilla is a seed or a plant that is also an interleukin-4 inhibitor. It contains rosmarinic acid, which has been shown as an anti-inflammatory. And in animal studies, perilla has shown to improve memory and cognitive function and reduce brain inflammation as well as oxidative stress. So some of my favorites are turmeric, resveratrol, curcumin, or turmeric, resveratrol, perilla, and quercetin. We actually use it in one formula. Stress management, I'm preaching to the choir, but stress management is huge because it's going to contribute to inflammatory cytokines and oxidative stress in the brain, both which can impair not just the way we traditionally think about it, but it impairs this cholesterol transport, and that cholesterol transport dysfunction can lead to neurodegenerative diseases. So stress reduction and mindfulness is essential in our patients. Get adequate sleep, aim for 6 to 8 hours. When we get chronic sleep deprivation has been associated with cognitive impairment and dysregulation of lipid metabolism. If you get less than 6.5 hours of sleep, you have a 30% reduction in your immune system, and you automatically upregulate what's called IL-6, which is an inflammatory cytokine. So you reduce your immune's effectiveness internally to your own brain, and you increase oxidative stress and inflammation just from not sleeping. And 1 day of lack of sleep has that same blast radius for 3 days. So 1 night of poor sleep leads to 3 days of immune dysfunction and increased inflammation systemically, including the brain. Avoid environmental toxins. Exposure to environmental toxins such as heavy metals and pesticides do contribute to inflammation and oxidative stress in the brain. And we're seeing more and more of this come out with paraquat leading to Parkinson's disease. We live in a world full of pesticides and environmental toxins. So here are some examples of labs that we might run. A standard lipid panel. So your lipid panel that gets cholesterol, LDL, HDL, and triglycerides. So I put a little note in here. It's a little cheap, easy test. Triglycerides should not be less than 2 times your HDL. Some say 3 times, but the strictest standards are 2 times. So if you fasted for 12 hours or even 8 hours, triglycerides are your raw fuel that you have in your system. You shouldn't have a lot of raw fuel if you haven't eaten for a while. Now, it's going to go up dramatically if you've eaten recently. So as your triglycerides go up, it forces your HDL down. So you want to see that number fasting less than 2 times your HDL. It's an inexpensive surrogate of mitochondrial health. And if you see this number high, there can be one of 2 things. If it's 12 hours later, it may not be that they're eating the wrong foods. It may be they're eating too many high sugar foods or carbohydrates, but it may be a poor mitochondrial health. And they could go on a low carb diet or a no carb diet and still have this going on if their mitochondria aren't functioning correctly. So here I just think you can think about mitochondrial support such as choline and carnitine and B1, B2, B3, CoQ10, PQQ, urolithin A, and ATO-GG. Anything you want to use for mitochondrial support, you kind of want to see that triglyceride lower and the HDL come up, in addition to just restricting their sugars and carbohydrates. Additional markers for cholesterol transport. Here's the apolipoprotein A1, which I've talked about a lot because I think it's super important. Low levels of Apo A-1 may indicate impaired cholesterol transport and increased risk of cardiovascular disease. If you don't have enough Apo A-1, you can't take out those particles in your tunica intima, that foam cell, and you can't do protection in your brain. So HDL is super important to try and get as high as possible. Apo B, we talked about, is the primary protein in LDL and all of your atherogenic cholesterol. High levels of Apo B may indicate impaired cholesterol transport and increased risk of neurodegenerative diseases. So we typically think about this as cardiovascular disease, which it is, but it's going to increase your risk of neurodegenerative diseases and the potential of microclots in the brain. And we talked about that lipoprotein a, which is that tail that hangs off of that ship. It is actually a higher risk factor than anything else for cardiovascular disease. These are the people that have an Lp(a) of 250 or higher, but their cholesterol is normal, but they had a heart attack anyway. So they're thin, they're fit, they exercise, they do everything right. Their cholesterol was 165, and they had a heart attack. Those are the people that have a high Lp(a). More information on apolipoprotein A1. It has several neuroprotective properties that make it important for brain health. It promotes taking the cholesterol back out of the brain, so reverse cholesterol transport. And it removes that excess cholesterol, like I said, from the brain, brings it back to the liver. This is important for preventing the buildup of cholesterol in the brain. It also reduces inflammation. So that's super important for our brain. Apo A-1 has been shown to have an anti-inflammatory properties, which can help protect the brain from inflammation-induced damage. In animal studies, it has been shown to reduce the pro-inflammatory cytokines of interleukin-1 beta, and TNF-alpha, which reduce microglial activation when they're present. Those are driven by NF-kappa B, and that is the hallmark of inflammation. NF-kappa B driving interleukin-1 beta and TNF-alpha is the first step of inflammation. It also has an enhancement of antioxidants. So it helps to enhance the brain's antioxidant defenses, which can help protect against the oxidative stress. It has been shown to increase the activity of antioxidant enzymes such as SOD, catalase, and MDA. It also helps to improve cognitive function. So Apo A1 has been shown to improve cognitive function in animal studies. In one study, mice that were genetically modified to overproduce the A1 showed improvement in performance in spatial tasks, suggesting that Apo A1 may play a role in promoting cognitive dysfunction, probably due to the 3 previous subsets. So I just put a quick little slide in here with a reference. Apo A1 also has suppression of tumor growth, reduces metastasis, increases your CD8 T cells, increases anti-tumor macrophages. So if we all just to speak frankly, we all get cancer, but our body can scavenger them. It's harder to do with a low Apo A1. Apo A1 has tremendous, not just cardioprotective, but it promotes anti-tumor tumorigenesis. So other inflammatory markers that I'm sure many of you are looking at are the C-reactive protein, but some other ones are IL-6, which we don't typically run all the time, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. These are just inflammatory cytokines, so it's important to maybe keep an eye on that. And I know there's a course in here on the Shoemaker protocols of SIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So you can look at TGF-beta, VEGF, MMP9, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, C3a, C4a, and leptin. They're all inflammatory-driven. TGF-beta, 1, super important. As it rises, we know something's going on. So is that a marker you guys run?
Yes, we teach all of these in our capstone, our level 4 class, when we're talking about biotoxins very specifically. Yeah.
So TGF-beta goes high when you're around any kind of biotoxin. It can go high when you're sick at all. It is neither pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. It is both. And TGF-beta goes up tremendously high with cancer. So you kind of see these overlaps between chronic inflammatory response syndrome, neurodegenerative diseases, cancer, atherogenesis. It's all related to this inflammatory piece. So TGF-beta in SIRS is actually somewhat protective against, well, SIRS is somewhat protective against cancer. Not that I would be a way to go about it, but people with SIRS, it seems the immune system gets distracted to that SIRS profile and not towards cancer. But TGF-beta is something that if it goes high, you certainly don't want it to stay high. Check your nutrient status, such as vitamin D, vitamin B12, folate, omega-3 fatty acids. These are all important for cholesterol transport. And I know you've all heard these before, but it's in putting this together, it's really nice for me to hear for myself selfishly that a lot of things we look at have such a pleomorphic effect on so many different things. And so I know I'm focusing on cholesterol transport here, but we're looking at those for other reasons. Before I ever heard the word cholesterol transport, we were looking at some of these things. So, and of course, the heavy metal exposure to heavy metals and toxins and pesticides can contribute to the inflammatory and oxidative stress in the brain. So testing for those as well is important. A little bit about AGEs, advanced glycosylated end products. So this is how healthy sugar metabolism or too much sugar in the body will lead to these advanced glycosylated end products. So we get this basically sugar stuck to a piece of protein in the body, and they're oxidative and they lead to inflammation, oxidative stress, and tissue breakdown. They also will start to, when you get increase in glycosylated end products, you intensely turn on your own autoantibodies. So this will trigger an autoimmune flare. So you'll get more antibodies. And if you happen to have autoimmune dysfunction or any autoantibodies in your own brain, as maybe established by the neural zoomer, if you do the neural zoomer and you see some of these autoantibodies to your own brain, you're going to accelerate that process just by having elevated sugars or advanced glycosylated end products. So impairment in this reverse cholesterol transport, AGEs can impair the function of apolipoprotein A-1, which kind of established is a super important protein to have, can lead up to buildup of cholesterol in the brain. This can contribute to development of atherosclerosis and also increased risk of stroke and other cardiovascular diseases. With increase in AGEs, we'll get increased in oxidative stress and inflammation, which can contribute to the development of neurodegenerative diseases as well. AGEs can also damage proteins in the brain, leading to impaired function and neurodegeneration. So looking at this through the very narrow lens of cholesterol transport, we see all these factors from vitamin D and DNA transcription, and then the same type of approaches that we would use for other inflammation, such as curcumin and turmeric and perilla and quercetin, overlapping with a very thin window of cholesterol transport. Also, when you get AGEs, you'll break down the blood-brain barrier. When you break down the blood-brain barrier, you'll start to allow inflammatory molecules into the brain. You'll lose those tight junctions within the brain. And when you lose those tight junctions within the brain, the peripheral immune system can then enter the brain. And when that happens, you'll turn your microglia cells, which are kind of like your brain's macrophages, and they go to what they call M1 max, where they become destructive, instead of M2 max, which are protective. So just by a breach in the blood-brain barrier, you can start to turn on this inflammatory state. Then you get this accumulation, which makes it extremely hard for the Apo A-1 to pull out all that debris because it's kind of stuck in there. So what can you do for advanced glycosylated end products? Just pulled out some research. Of course, the vitamin C, alpha lipoic acid, carnosine, which we also talked about before. A fat-soluble B1 has been shown to have an anti-glycation properties. You can use curcumin, which we've talked about at length, and resveratrol, which we've talked about at length. So they don't just have one effect, they have this pleomorphic effect. Green tea catechins are super helpful. One of my favorite, if not my favorite, is NAC, N-acetylcysteine. It's the precursor to glutathione. It's hugely important, not just to prevent AGEs. It helps keep healthy endothelial lining in your gut, so it's helpful for that. Your lungs. Glutathione, if glutathione is present, actually research says if you have healthy glutathione, you will not get an autoimmune disease and you will not get leaky gut. Glutathione goes down during times of stress. It goes down during times of lack of sleep. Omega-3 fatty acids are helpful, and vitamin D. So we hit these same core concepts with many different same core concepts, many different avenues. So again, I'm just going to leave some time for questions, but if we look at the top 8 causes of death, we see heart disease, certainly related to what we talked about, cancer, certainly what we talked about, stroke, of course, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, of course, and chronic liver disease. So it may not have an effect on accidents. It may or may not have an effect. I think it does on chronic lower respiratory disease, because I think if we support everything we spoke of with antioxidants and N-acetylcysteine, you're going to reduce the risk of lower respiratory disease as well. So I made it through. I just put it together a little bit ago. Any questions?
Fantastic. You didn't need to tell us that. Nobody would have guessed. This is a brilliant presentation. You know this stuff inside and out. Thank you so much. I see some great questions popping in here. I have a couple of quick ones just I want to kick us off with. You teased us that there are some new tests that can show if you are reducing or even eliminating the risks of Alzheimer's disease. Are you able to share what those are? I'm going to assume that that is not something that is available to us as unlicensed practitioners, but just so we can be aware of that for clients.
Well, I think, we may be able to make that happen, just like we did with Vibrant. So I think we could. It's the prodrome test, which checks for plasmalogens. So when you take a fatty acid, an essential fatty acid, it goes into the peroxisome of the cell and it comes back out as a plasmalogen. The plasmalogen is the useful form. And when you have peroxisome breakdown, you can't make your plasmalogens. So plasmalogens are the useful form. And the prodrome test tests for plasmalogens. Dr. Goodnow out of University of Chicago, yes, he's Canadian, but he did most of his research there. He shows that if you have proper plasmalogen levels, this is one person's opinion, but he's well respected, you can eliminate the risk of an Apo E-4/4 genotype for Alzheimer's.
Wow.
So the prodrome test, it's a plasmalogen test. It does a simple, it really checks for the amount of omega-9s and omega-3s that you have, and then how many of them are being converted over to plasmalogens, as well as it checks for mitochondrial health. Very simply, the test is right around $500. It's fasting, obviously, because you're going to check your triglyceride to cholesterol ratio. Yeah. Fabulous test. He has also formulated, a little bit ancestral here, but he has formulated the only marketable plasmalogen. So it's an omega-3 plasmalogen and an omega-9 plasmalogen, but he shows tremendous research in recovery from not only things like autism, but neurodegenerative diseases, including Parkinson's and cognitive decline, as well as MS.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
That's fantastic. I will definitely be wanting to talk more about that. You also teased us with a formula that you use that combines the resveratrol, curcumin, quercetin, and perilla in one. Is that one? Is that a proprietary or is that a product?
No, so I freely share. It's a formula that I came up with, but I have no royalties on. So I just wanted the formula. So there's going to be 2 companies making it. The first one that is making it currently is Mechanism Wellness. It's called the Extinguisher.
Okay.
It is our number 1 supplement we use in the office, and it is impactful. And then another company is going to make the same formula, but we're going to add, in addition to that, boswellia in it.
Ooh.
And we're going to try to supercharge the curcumin. So the Extinguisher is out now. Very inexpensive, super effective. Dose dependent. I dose people 2 caps twice a day if they're incredibly inflamed, and reduce them to 1 cap twice a day otherwise. Patients absolutely love it. It's a great price point. And it's just, again, it's my formulation, but I have no vested interest in it whatsoever. I wanted the formula, so they made it for me. And so the other company is going to make it for me as well, but I have no royalties on that as well. So I think they're phenomenal.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, we've got some great questions here. Dave is asking, what's the ratio between Apo A and Apo B?
Yeah, so if you take your Apo B over your Apo A1, there's a lot of people have different ratios. 0.7 is the ratio that most people will tell you. Some will raise it to 0.8. Healthiest is 0.5. So you really want that you want your Apo B in a vacuum. If you looked at Apo B just in a vacuum, goal is to have it below 90 is optimal. Unless you've had an event, then you want it as low as possible. Below 100 is the next cutoff, and it kind of goes off 110 from there. But if you had, like I had a patient today whose Apo B was 88, but Apo A1 was 80. So that's inverse. Mm-hmm. Usually you'll see an Apo A1 170, 160, 180. And so if you have an Apo B at 95, but your Apo A1 is at 200, that's okay, even though you haven't hit your target mark for Apo B. But the gold standard would be Apo B below 90 and Apo A1 twice that. So think of it, if you do the ratio and you want to put people's mind at ease, you can start at 0.7, but you want to get it as low as possible. For all the reasons, if we stack the cards in our favor, we really reduce the number one cause of death here. And it's beneficial in number 2, number 4, number 6, and number 7. So
it's wonderful. Victoria asks, is there an association between the glycocalyx brain health and Alzheimer's? Glycocalyx, I might be pronouncing that.
Yeah, the glycocalyx is a breakdown of the blood vessels. So what you can get, I wouldn't say there's a correlation, of course, between Alzheimer's, but certainly vascular dementia. So vascular dementia is much more applicable because when you get microclots, which can come as a consequence of poor vascular health and poor glycocalyx, or if they have mild undetected. So one of the things that we're thinking is you might have SIRS in a level that's not Shoemaker level, but this chronic biotoxin exposure. And one of the hallmarks of SIRS is coagulation defects, as evidenced by microclots, which can only be seen on a 9 Tesla MRI machine, but also a breakdown of the endocalyx. So yes, I think endocalyx support, nitric oxide support is super important. As it turns out, that's one of the benefits of your Apo E genotype to promote nitric oxide, as well as, get your citrulline and your arginine and your beets and everything else.
Right. Would you use octane 8 MCT oil as a direct way to get fat to the brain, though bypassing the liver, having to stimulate the beginning of other transports?
So it can be. So you can use that, but it still has to be actively transported on a boat because it can't get through the bloodstream on its own because the blood is water. And so you need to make that lipophilic particle. So it has to still get there on an Apo A1 in order to get into the brain. So it's a great way to bypass some of it. You can shortcut some of the pathways, but it eventually needs to jump on a boat, and that boat needs to be an Apo A1.
Ellen asks, can sulforaphane play a role with the other supplements mentioned?
Sure. So sulforaphane or glucoraphanin in broccoli seed extract is going to help reduce the inflammatory burden. It's going to increase your natural killer cells. It's synergistic with Apo A1 and its anti-tumorigenesis. And it may play a role in turning those M1 MACs, those angry microglia in the brain, back over to an M2 MAC with the same thing that rosmarinic acid does in perilla. So one of the keys with that is also there's a ginsenomide, a G1 ginsenomide, a ginseng that does that too. So they work very synergistically together, keeping the burden off your cholesterol transport, because you don't have that burden of these anti-inflammatory effects. Glucoraphanin and broccoli seed extract is going to be helpful to lessen the job of the Apo A-1 and the Apo E.
At what point after running all these CVD labs would you run an MPO?
So we don't run it as often as you may think. I don't think it's bad to run it right away. I'm trying to keep it to a minimum. If you have a family history, personal history, more important, I would probably lean towards a coronary calcium score if you're above 50 to see what's going on, to see if there's any calcification. But you can run F2 isoprostanes and MPO. You can run all those. I just don't tend to run them as much because they're all inflammatory in nature. So if I'm looking at inflammatory markers and I'm trying to get those down, it may be a blind spot in my care. I don't run a ton of them.
Mary asks, should we ask clients to check with their doctors before giving them any omegas if they're on blood thinners? So
the answer is yes, but not for the reason you might think. The answer is yes, because the doctor is going to freak out. But those studies of fish oils being blood thinners were all negated. So as long as the fish oil isn't rancid or oxidized, so if you use a good fish oil that has a good expiration date, that's either packaged in an amber color bottle if it's liquid, or hasn't oxidized, maybe has a little bit of tocopherols in it, something that prevents it from going rancid. All of those studies have been, so you can stand on strong legal ground in the court of law saying it's not going to lead to thinning, but you're not going to stand on the court of popular opinion if their PCP says, I can't believe they put you on a fish oil if you're on a blood thinner. So that's a your call thing. I think you're going to get negative press out of it, but you're not going to put the patients at risk over it.
All right. It's always a big conversation we have in our blood chemistry class. So thanks for helping clarify that.
It doesn't cause blood thinning, but nobody knows that. So you're going to get blamed if anything goes wrong. So you just need to know. Yeah.
Totally. And then Carrie asks, what is the range for the lipoprotein little a?
So lipoprotein little a is the lower the better. So the cutoff is on like LabCorp, it's at 75, but risk factors start at 50. Typically what you see is I call the double humped camel. What I mean by that is you'll see people at like 15 or 12 or 25, and then you'll see people at 175. It's sometimes you see them in between, but when you see somebody at like 90 or 95, it's because they probably should be on a standard American diet, like around 175, but they've worked really hard to get it at 90. But somebody who gets it down to 90 is never going to get it to 12 because they don't have that genetic predisposition. They just have a long tail, is what I tell them. Your tail's too long. You're going to step on it every now and again. So the normal range is below 75, but you want it below 50 is where the first quartile of risk starts. There's a drug now coming out for it. The only thing that I know, I think I said this last time, niacin does reduce it. The study that said niacin reduces it by 33% up to 40% also showed no cardiovascular benefit. It was important to note that everybody in that study was on a max dose of statin at the same time. So if you're on a max dose statin, you might not see tremendous benefit, but I think it's still beneficial to get it. Once the drug comes out, every fresh PCP out there is going to know about it and everybody's going to be on it. Again, we don't even check it now. So, yeah. So.
Brooke's got an interesting question here about the interplay of the Apo B to A1 ratio and then blood pressure and heart rate. So how would you explain an Apo B of 138, the B to A1 ratio of 0.77, but a normal blood pressure, so 90 to 110 over 70 to 80, and 48 resting heart rate?
So not a correlation to blood pressure unless you start to break down what may happen is if you break down your endocalyx, you may get some higher blood pressure. But what was the Apo B?
The Apo B was 138.
And the Apo A1 was?
She doesn't say here, but the B to A1 ratio is 0.77.
So I'm not happy with that. And I'll tell you why I'm not happy with that, because the 138 by itself is an independent risk factor, and they're not optimized because they're not at 0.5. I mean, if you're going to have an ApoB at 138, you better have an ApoB to Apo A-1 ratio of 0.5. So I would work really hard to get that 138 down. My next question would be, do you have a clean coronary calcium score? And do you have a family history of any cardiovascular disease or microvascular dementia? If you have none of those, you may be doing okay, but you're risking it with an ApoB at 138 in and of itself, regardless of anything else that puts you at higher risk.
Yeah, I agree. Kim's asking if SPM, so the specialized pro-resolving mediators, are good interventions for inflammation.
They're phenomenal interventions for inflammation. So the SPMs are probably why fish oil helps reduce inflammation, because not all fish oil helps to reduce inflammation, but SPMs do intervene. So you get what's called D and E resolvins. That's what's in your SPMs. D and E resolvins come from EPA and DHA. That's how they get their names. They're actually called resolvins, which means they're resolving inflammation in that acute stage. So yes, I do love SPMs.
Excellent. And this will be our last question. I think Victoria's just wanting to dig in a little bit further on the niacin piece. She says here that Peter Attia argues that niacin isn't effective. There's a lot of controversy with whether it works or not. Are there any other resources that you can point her to investigate further?
So I have, in the first presentation, I pointed out the studies that showed niacin was effective at lowering lipoprotein(a). Peter Attia poo-poos niacin, and I love Peter Attia, but Peter Attia also says check it once. And I can tell you from personal history, I've had a personal LP(a) above 200, and now it's below 100. So if I checked it once, I would be at the highest quartile of risk, and now I'm in the second quartile of risk. I can't get it below that. So I don't necessarily agree. Peter Attia also feels that he is an ApoB fanatic. Remember, he has a confirmation bias. He comes from a family history of cardiovascular disease, and he tends, his words, not mine, he has strong convictions loosely held. This conviction he holds on to strongly. He thinks everybody's ApoB should be like 50, and I don't know that that's accurate or not. And so I think he poo-poos niacin. My statement is, what's the harm? I might get a little flushing. There's no real negative side effects other than a little bit of flushing. But if you can reduce my LP(a) by 40%,
it's huge.
The statistics show unequivocally I have reduced my risk of cardiovascular disease by a magnitude, whether it came from niacin that a study didn't show or not. I don't buy it. I mean, I'd be curious when they come out with this anti-senescence, this oligonucleotide drug for lipoprotein(a). I want to see it go head-to-head against niacin when they didn't do max dose statins and see what happens. I could be wrong, and I'm open to it. My thing is, if I give you niacin at a sub-threshold of flushing and your lipoprotein(a) goes down, I didn't cause you any harm. I may not have done you any good, but I didn't charge you $100 for a bottle of niacin. And I think we're doing okay. And I explain that to people. Studies show it has no benefit, even though all the numbers look better. That's kind of counterintuitive to me. All your number one risk factor for cardiovascular disease was cut by 40%, but it had no effect on your risk. I think they've looked at the studies wrong. And I would say, I'd yield, Peter Attia reads studies a heck of a lot better than I do, but we disagree on a few things. This is one of them.
Great. Oh my goodness, this has been fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Turnpaugh. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
Thank you too.